welcome to American Catholic History, made possible by listeners like you. If you like our podcast, be sure to rate us and give us a review wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
As longtime listeners know, we had to take a break from podcasting while Tom completed his Montessori training. He's mostly finished with that now, and we're so excited to get back into recording. And this episode is something we're particularly excited to do.
Yes, what we're doing here is re-recording about a topic that we covered previously. We've learned more about this topic, and I think we've learned a lot more about putting these episodes together, so redoing them is an opportunity to do them better.
We'll be re-recording a number of our back episodes in the months ahead as we work to get our entire back catalog back online, so watch out for them.
I look forward to going back through a number of our topics, so let's get to today's story.
Right. Today's topic, Retold, is a story about Catholics and spirits.
Really, it's the foundation of the pilgrimage that we playfully call our Spirit and Spirits Tour.
Yes. The one spirit we're talking about is, of course, the Holy Spirit, meaning the work the Spirit did in the hearts and minds of certain Catholics.
And then the other spirit we're talking about is not a supernatural entity at all, but rather that lovely American creation from the heart of horse racing and bluegrass, bourbon whiskey.
So we're talking about bourbon and about the Catholics who carved a community out of the Kentucky wilderness. They were early adopters of this new, distinctly American style of whiskey, and they established what became the base for Catholicism west of the Appalachian Mountains. Then, 130 years later, they saved bourbon from the ravages of Prohibition.
There is so much in this episode, so many, wow, that's really neat sorts of things.
Which is why we lead an annual pilgrimage to the region, our Spirit and Spirits Tour. It's astonishing how much early Catholicism happened right there in Kentucky. It is a great American Catholic history place to visit.
It truly is. I hope American Catholics would consider a pilgrimage within our own country to learn about our own history. And this is one great place to start. Check out our pilgrimages page at americancatholichistory.org/pilgrimages to get information.
So, you ready to start?
Hang on a second. There we go. Very nice.
So where's mine?
I gotcha. Here, let me bring it over.
Oh, yes.
Okay. A little bit of room noise there for you. We don't have special expensive chairs and super quiet everything. We make do, and we do a good job, I think. Anyhow.
Okay, so should we really begin now?
We should begin now.
Okay.
So we begin in 17th century Maryland. As a reminder, the colony of Maryland was founded in the 1630s explicitly to be a Catholic haven in the New World. It didn't take long, however, for anti-Catholic elements to make life difficult for Catholics and then eventually to completely outlaw Catholicism.
Right. We talked about all of this early history of Maryland in other episodes when we talked about the coming of the Ark and the Dove, the two ships who brought the first settlers to Maryland, and then again when we talked about Margaret Brent, who was truly a remarkable woman.
She really was, but she didn't make bourbon.
No, that's probably the only knock we could have on her.
Yeah, I'd say so.
But she did make it possible for these other folks to live in relative freedom for a while.
Right, for a time. But from the late 1600s until the American Revolution, Catholics in Maryland largely lived as second-class citizens. The Mass could not be offered publicly, and Catholics couldn't hold political office.
It was during this time when the ancestors of our heroes settled in Maryland. There are lots of individuals involved in this, but the ones we'll focus on at the outset are the very Catholic Hayden family. The Haydens came from England to Jamestown, Virginia in the 1660s. In 1678, Francis Hayden moved from Jamestown to St. Mary's City, the colonial capital of Maryland. And there the Haydens remained for more than 100 years.
Until Francis Hayden's great-grandson came along, the inspired Hayden, he for whom a lovely spirit is named, Basil.
Basil Hayden.
Yes, Basil Hayden Sr. And this is where the first, oh, well, that's neat moment really happened for me. I've enjoyed Basil Hayden bourbon many times over the years and never had any idea that there was an actual person behind the name, much less a hale and hearty Catholic leader.
But there he is, a bourbon legend.
Yes, further proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy.
Absolutely. After the Revolution, Maryland adopted a new state constitution, one that guaranteed religious liberty. One of the main framers of that constitution was Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence. We have an episode about him as well. He was the wealthiest man in the colonies at the time of the Revolution.
But even with that new state constitution, the history of anti-Catholic persecution wasn't forgotten. In the early 1780s, a largish group of Catholic families living in southern Maryland felt that they needed to move somewhere more remote to have the true level of religious freedom that they desired.
So they formed a compact, which they called a league, affirming that they would move en masse to a relatively unsettled portion of central Kentucky County, Virginia, a place that is now Nelson County, Kentucky.
Right, because until 1792, Kentucky was part of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Basil Hayden Sr. was selected as the leader of this group of about 60 families who formed the League, and in 1785 he led the first group of 25 Catholic families on a dangerous trek from St. Mary, Maryland to Kentucky County, Virginia.
We should note that the entire area of southern Maryland is chock full of great historical Catholic sites like the ruins of St. Mary City, which is now an outdoor museum. We have a pilgrimage itinerary for that region too, so if you want to go there, contact us. It's a beautiful, peaceful place to visit. Keep an eye on our pilgrimage page for trips that we plan to that region and join us.
And this was the region that they left, but they went to an equally beautiful part of the country. In the area around the tiny city of Bardstown, they set up their homesteads and lived in close proximity. They provided support and protection for one another, and they had another big idea.
Yes, they expected that since they had moved in such a large group and established such a concentrated Catholic community, that the church hierarchy would eventually have to establish a permanent parish with a permanent priest in their midst.
Now, they weren't the first Catholics to settle in present-day Kentucky. A few families had moved to the Lexington area in 1775, but this group, led by Basil Hayden, was the first mass movement with the intention of establishing a significant Catholic presence. They arrived, mostly settling along Pottinger's Creek just outside of Bardstown, and that's where the magic happened.
You make it seem like everything was easy for them once they got there and, magically bourbon and Catholicism
Well,
happened.
I'm sure they had struggles, but who wants to dwell on those? We've got the establishment of the church west of the Appalachians and some of the great bourbon distilleries to talk about. So, kind of yes, magically.
Okay, so, let's then talk about what happened at Pottinger's Creek.
Well, as for the establishment of the church, the plan worked out pretty well. In 1787, a small church was built on the land of Basil Hayden. That marked the first purpose-built Catholic church within the United States west of the Appalachians.
An important distinction because many other Catholic churches already existed in the vast lands controlled by France and Spain west of this region.
Yes, and we're talking within the land that was part of the United States at the time. So this first church, Holy Cross, was built in 1787, and to this day, there is a small church on this site, though the present structure was built in 1823, and we visit every time we take pilgrims to the region.
Mm-hmm. The pastor of that parish, Father Richard Gooden, is a friend of ours. He's a native of the area and has some great stories to tell about the families and history of the region. We interviewed him, and the recording of that interview is available for our supporters. He's a really great storyteller, dry Kentucky wit.
Hilarious.
And you might enjoy tuning in to hear him and our other interviews.
And yeah, that was a great conversation. Father Gooden is such a good man. I'm glad we made that connection. Mm-hmm. So yes, the church now known as Holy Cross, that isn't its original name, and the story of its name change is among the stories that Father Gooden told us. But that first church was built in 1787. That same year, 1787, Father Whalen, some sources say Charles Whalen, others say Maurice, came out from Maryland, and he stayed for 18 months before returning east. Then in 1791, another priest, Father William de Rohan, came up from North Carolina. But he wasn't authorized to be there by Bishop John Carroll of Baltimore. so he had to stop serving as their priest. Then, in 1793, success came. Father Stephen Baden, the first priest ordained in the United States, was sent by Bishop Carroll to Kentucky,
which had been admitted to the Union as the 15th state in 1792, just
Right.
1 year before.
Yes, and Baden helped to stabilize Catholic worship in Kentucky.
For the first 4 years of his time there, he was the lone priest ministering to 300 Catholic families spread out from Bardstown to Lexington. He bought a farm near Bardstown to serve as his home base. His farm, which he called St. Stephen's, eventually became the mother house for the Sisters of Loretto, same sisters who built that famous staircase in Santa Fe.
Yep.
In fact, over his many years in Kentucky, Baden would purchase land all over the place with his own money, or with money he borrowed, to build many of the earliest churches and other Catholic institutions in Kentucky.
Beginning in 1797, a few other priests came and helped Father Baden, and in 1805, the Dominicans came and established the first Dominican priory and seminary and built a church dedicated to St. Rose.
Also on our pilgrimage itinerary and the subject of a popular episode.
Yeah, we've done a lot of those. Over the years, more religious establishments came, including the Trappists, who established Gethsemane Abbey. This tri-county area of Nelson, Marion, and Washington counties had such a Catholic population and had so many great Catholic firsts that it became known as the Kentucky Holy Land. To this day, even in very Protestant Kentucky, this region is solidly Catholic and really doesn't have any Protestant churches.
But we're getting way ahead of ourselves. We talk about a lot of this in other episodes, so let's get back to Basil Hayden, the other families, and the bourbon.
Right, the bourbon. Right. One very cool last Catholic first. Well, one last very cool Catholic first. There we go. That I'll bring up here, and it is directly related to Basil Hayden. So in 1808, Pope Pius VII made Baltimore an archdiocese and created the dioceses of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Bardstown.
I always thought there was something incongruous about Bardstown being listed along with Boston, New York, and Philly. The other three make sense to have been created dioceses out of Baltimore, but Bardstown?
Major cities, yeah. I know, but that is how significant a Catholic center Bardstown had become by that point. They needed something west of the Appalachians, and it really was the Catholic center west of the Appalachians, still within the United States. So, we get to this more in depth in other episodes, but the neat point here is that when the first bishop of Bardstown, the saintly Benedict Joseph Flaget, was laying the groundwork to build St. Joseph Cathedral, the land for it was donated by Basil Hayden.
Yeah, that's so cool. So the first Catholic cathedral west of the Appalachians was built on land donated by a whiskey baron, and it is situated right in the heart of Bourbon country.
And not only that, but if you look at the Cathedral of St. Joseph in Bardstown on a map online, you'll see that right next to it is the Oscar Getz Museum of Whiskey History and the grounds of the Kentucky Bourbon Festival.
And the building that the Oscar Getz Museum occupies is historic Spalding Hall, which was built to be St. Joseph College, the first Catholic college in Kentucky.
Yeah, Spalding Hall was used as a hospital during the Civil War and eventually run as an orphanage and school by the Sisters of Charity and the Zavarian brothers. It is named for the longtime Bishop of Louisville, Martin Spalding, but again, more on that later.
Okay. So we've finally said all we should say at this point about all of the things Basil Hayden and family did for the church in Kentucky. So now about the bourbon.
Right. So Basil Hayden and other Catholic families who came with him did all the things pioneers do to survive and thrive, and among those was make whiskey. The sort of whiskey made in that part of the country has come to be known as bourbon, named after Bourbon County, Kentucky.
As we said before, bourbon is a distinctly American whiskey. Now, by law, for something to be called bourbon, the grains used in the mash must be 51% corn. It must be made in the United States, not just Kentucky, but in the United States. It must be aged for at least 1 year in a new charred white oak barrel. It must be distilled to a maximum of 160 proof, barreled at a maximum of 125 proof, and bottled at a minimum of 80 proof.
Whew. It's a mouthful. Those requirements weren't all in place from the beginning, of course, but the majority corn content was a distinctive characteristic from the outset. So Basil Hayden and other new Catholic immigrants got into the making of bourbon, and some of them got really, really good at it. So much so that some of the biggest names in bourbon came from this Catholic influx. Medley, Wathen. Wathen single barrel is actually what we're enjoying right now as we record.
Yes, and it's delicious.
It really is. And other Catholic bourbon makers include J.W. Dant, Willett, Calvert, and the biggest name in bourbon, Jim Beam.
A number of those families are still, to this day, parishioners at St. Joseph Proto-Cathedral, including members of the Beam and Willett families. But Jim Beam wasn't himself one of those original Catholic families.
No, the Jim Beam on the bottle is actually James Beauregard Beam, who ran the family distillery before and after Prohibition. He was the great-grandson of the man who started the family whiskey business, Johannes Beam. Johannes was a Catholic from Germany whose family came over to the new United States, changed their name from Böhm to Beam, and settled in this Catholic region of Kentucky around the same time. Johannes started selling whiskey in 1795. After he died, his descendants kept at it and called their whiskey Old Tub.
In the early 20th century, James Beauregard Beam took over for his father, David Beam. His distillery was shut down in 1920 when Prohibition began, and he went into other entrepreneurial ventures, including selling stone. But he didn't like that, and was only too eager to rebuild the family business near his home in Bardstown in 1933 after Prohibition ended.
After his death, the whiskey was officially renamed Jim Beam in his honor. So James B. Beam was among the Catholics who helped save bourbon through Prohibition. More on that in a minute, but today, the master distillers at Jim Beam are Frederick Noe and his son, also named Frederick, who are the 7th and 8th generations of the Beam family to run the family business.
But while the Beam family may have become the biggest, the Haydens didn't disappear.
Right. Basil Hayden made and sold bourbon whiskey until his death, and when he died, his son Louis carried on the tradition. But neither of them decided to go big. It was Louis's son, Raymond Hayden, who took the plunge and made it big in bourbon whiskey.
And he named it in honor of his grandfather, but not by naming it Basil Hayden. He called his whiskey Old Grandad. It was his granddad's recipe, after all.
And under the name of Old Grandad, with a depiction of his grandfather, Basil Hayden, gracing the label, Raymond Hayden's bourbon became one of the most popular bourbons on the market.
But he didn't live long enough to enjoy the success. Raymond Hayden died only 3 years after launching his distillery, and he had no heirs. Eventually, his distillery made it into the hands of the Catholic Wathen family, who by that point had made their own success in the bourbon business. Nowadays, the Old Grandad label is produced by the Jim Beam Company, but it still has a depiction of Basil Hayden Sr. right in the center.
And Old Grandad isn't the only whiskey Jim Beam produces as a tribute to the patriarch of Catholic bourbon. In 1992, Jim Beam began producing a series of small batch specialty bourbons, one of which they called Basil Hayden's. And what a gift to bourbon drinkers. They claimed that this bourbon recipe uses a grain profile very similar to Basil Hayden's original 1792 recipe, having a much higher rye content on top of the 51% corn. And I can attest it is a lovely spirit. Very sippable and delicious.
Now, we said that James Beam was among the Catholics who saved bourbon during Prohibition. Also important was the Wathen family.
Yes, the Wathen family, whom we mentioned a couple of times before, was still in the whiskey-making business when Prohibition went into effect in 1920. At that time, there were millions of gallons of whiskey still aging in barrels in rickhouses all over the place. Those rickhouses were not large and were very vulnerable to break-in. The government discussed buying all of the whiskey or ordering it all destroyed, but a number of doctors had a better idea. Thank goodness for doctors.
Yes, doctors still considered whiskey to be a helpful medicinal tonic. How helpful? We're not quite sure, but they prescribed doses of it for various ailments. With the intervention of these doctors, the government ordered that all remaining whiskey barrels be moved to large, secure rickhouses in major cities where they could be protected.
Then stepped in three sons of J.B. Wathen. These inspired men formed the American Medicinal Spirits Company, and they took control of America's critical bourbon medicine supply.
So, needless to say, when Prohibition ended, they were well stocked.
And how? The American Medicinal Spirits Company was eventually acquired by Porter's National Distillers, and Richard Wathen, one of the three sons, went to work as a senior executive in that company.
And so, to this day, a number of those original Catholic families who trekked over the Appalachians are still in the area, still making bourbon, and still upholding the Catholicism of the region. The See of Bardstown moved to Louisville in 1841, and the Cathedral of St. Joseph became the proto-cathedral when the Cathedral of the Assumption was established in Louisville. But St. Joseph is still there, an imposing, beautiful basilica. So the next time you're looking for something to enjoy responsibly, perhaps in a mint julep, old-fashioned Manhattan Kentucky mule, or just by itself, perhaps with a few drops of water, reach for a Catholic spirit that hails from the Kentucky Holy Land. And if you're thinking about a pilgrimage, there aren't many places in the United States with as much Catholic history as this corner of Kentucky. We will be going back, and we invite you to join us. You've been listening to American Catholic History. If you enjoy American Catholic history, please become a supporter. Get information on how to become a supporter and the perks at americancatholichistory.org/support.
Also, on our website, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about Kentucky Catholics and bourbon, see about our pilgrimages. We plan on going back next June of 2025, and find other great stories from American Catholic history.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. Those and the 5-star ratings help others find us. You can also email us feedback, questions, tips for episode topics, or other comments at feedback@americancatholichistory.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/American Catholic History, on Instagram at ACH_podcast, and follow us on Twitter at ACH1513. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crowe.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Thank you once again for joining us on American Catholic History, made possible by listeners like you.